Hello everyone, I just wanted to leave a few comments on the Unit 2 discussion. I was just able to finish reading through all of your various posts and questions, and first and foremost, I want to commend you for doing an excellent job. This is one of the best discussion boards that I have seen in teaching History 1182. So please keep up the good work. You're doing a great job of contextualizing your questions, asking open-ended questions, and responding using evidence from the readings and from the videos. That doesn't always happen. So I commend you for doing an excellent job in all of those ways and for being very thoughtful in terms of the kind of key issues that you're pulling out of the readings and the videos for the unit. And of course, we were thinking about independence and the various ways that independence came to the Spanish Americas and to Brazil, or Portuguese America. And of course, there was a very large distinction between those two, because in the case of Brazil, a monarchy continued in power there, although with some liberal reforms. There were many questions and kind of references to liberalism and the kinds of reforms that might come with that. And I think that it is important to also keep in mind that liberalism in the 19th century, not the same thing as being a liberal today in the United States. Classical liberalism, or 19th century liberalism, in a lot of ways actually is more similar to what would be called a conservative stance in the United States today, especially in terms of economics and kind of political relationships. And what I mean by that is 19th century liberalism was kind of focused on the ideas coming out of the Enlightenment from Europe of having free markets. So we have Adam Smith who was talking about those kinds of things, keeping government interference out of the market, creating representative governments, not necessarily democracies. There's a difference there. A democracy kind of implies that everyone has a voice. Representative democracies give a lot of voice to a lot of different groups, but they are not necessarily extended to everyone. There were also focuses on things like freedom of speech, freedom of the press, freedom of religion, and those kinds of things. And so 19th century Latin American liberals certainly did buy into and support all of those various ideas that I was just mentioning. So something that many of us have touched on is this issue of why did Latin American countries get off to such a difficult and rocky start, seemingly? Somebody pointed out that there was a lot of violence, and could the transition have been peaceful to independence? And I think it might be helpful here to think in terms not necessarily of peace, but of stability. The American Revolution wasn't peaceful. The aftermath of it, trying to build a nation, create a state, wasn't necessarily peaceful. There was a lot of controversy. There were events like the Whiskey Rebellion. Politics were really ugly, actually, in the period after George Washington, leading into the early 19th century. So again, things weren't necessarily peaceful, but they were more stable. And so the question is, why was that the case? I really found Jose's question about the role of the Catholic Church in all of this to be really intriguing. He kind of asked whether or not the Church set up a situation in Latin American nations that prevented real democracy, whereas Protestant faiths kind of lend themselves to more democratic approaches. I think it's still important to realize that both were hierarchical, although there were Calvinistic and other traditions in the United States that were a bit more democratic in terms of allowing the men to have a voice in what was going on. The New England Town Meeting, of course, came out of all of that. So there is something there, I think. I mean, it's kind of interesting because Catholicism was hierarchical in a different way, and it was very much more culturally ingrained in Latin American nations through the process of transculturation that Chasteen talks about in his chapter on the colonial crucible, as he calls it. We, of course, didn't read that chapter on the colonial crucible. Sorry, I have a bug in my throat. But there's an idea called transculturation that has come out of anthropology, looking at Latin America. And what transculturation is thinking of is the ways in which both the dominant culture and the colonized culture influenced each other. And that was certainly the case in Latin America. Things like the Virgin of Guadalupe, for example, are specifically Mexican and indigenous manifestations of a Catholic icon of Mary. And so that's the kind of thing that he's talking about there. And the reason I bring it up is that we have to think about traditions and cultural legacies as well as Latin America's place in the international stage to try to understand the rise of caudillos like Rosas that many of us talked about. We'll read more about Santa Anna in Mexico, and so on. And these were men who were able to appeal to machismo. They were able to use patronage, meaning giving things, actually giving gifts, giving food, giving things people needed to them in exchange for political support. And their politics could change with the wind, depending on where it was blowing. And so what I'm pointing at here is this was in an unstable sort of system. Whereas the American system was rocky in many ways and could be violent, it ended up being a bit more stable in terms of its institutions. The institutions that were at least proposed in constitutions didn't hold up necessarily under the weight of caudillo types of rule. And some of that rose from tradition and culture in certain ways, because caudillos were able to appeal to people's cultural and traditional sensibilities. But also the role of international debt and the way that independence happened in the first place created a rocky start for Latin American nations. And then finally, adding on to this, something that I'm reading about in a new book I got on Latin American revolutions, and this is something that Chastain says too, is that two of the key issues in Latin American history are inequality and poverty. Latin America is a resource-rich region, I should say, with impoverished people. And so, we have to think about how that's the case. The United States wasn't necessarily as resource-rich, but it emerged stable. And so what I'm doing in this video here, hopefully, is just kind of posing a bunch of things for you to think about as we continue to look at the mid-19th century. The return of liberal politics by 1850 is where we're going next, and we're going to think about terms like order and progress with a capital P. And so there was a tendency by many Latin American leaders to want to keep up with the United States and keep up with Europe, get out of their debts, and become kind of on par in terms of mechanization and industrialization with these other nations. The question we have to keep in mind is, why didn't that happen? I don't know that it couldn't have happened. I almost phrased it that way, but why didn't it happen? So that's where we're headed next time. So keep up the good work. I enjoyed reading your work here, and I'm now going to turn to the Unit 2 journals.